I'd like to welcome you back to our study on the life of Joseph. We're going to be proceeding with our next part of the study. We're going to be getting into the dreams that were had by the Pharaoh. And really, this is going to be more than anything something that is focusing, as you can see on the opening title page here, the east wind, because that's what we're going to be looking at probably as uh, an oversimplified thought on this whole study, the east wind. So, over unity. Over unity is often referred to by its more common name, perpetual motion. What's the definition of over unity or perpetual motion? The motion of a theoretical mechanism that without any losses due to friction or other forms of loss of energy would continue to operate forever at the same rate without any external energy being applied to it and even show slight improvement. Over unity. Interesting term, and so I'm sure you're probably asking yourself, what in the world does this word have to do with their story about Joseph? Well, actually quite a lot, especially as we look into the next two dreams that come up in our story. The 7 fat cattle, the 7 lean cattle, the 7 good heads of grain, and the 7 bad ears of grain. And so essentially, over unity, or this idea behind perpetual motion, we want to take this out of the thought process of a machine and put this into the thought process of a nation, of a people, of a country. What is it that can make a people become perpetual, never ending? And I think that's pretty important. But before we get into our story of the 7 cattle and the 7 heads of grain, I'd like to just look at a little bit of history. And so what I have here is a list. This is not all-encompassing. It's just a list of a few countries: Sumer and Akkad, Mitannia, Babylonia, Assyria, the Hittites, the Phoenicians, the Carthaginians, the Elamites, the Midianites, the Sassanides, the Romans. And again, this is just a very short list of some of the more recognizable places that you might know. But why is it important? What do we need to learn or see? Well, for one, they are no more. They're gone. They're done. Their time came and went. What does that tell us? They were not perpetual kingdoms. They didn't continue forever. Every day they were deteriorating, heading straight to their demise, each at a rate equal to the evil and rebellion that they manifested. So, if you think about this just for a moment, if we take a nation and we make that nation completely rebellious against God, and they are dedicated to the destruction of all things good, that rate of deterioration would be far greater. It's very fast. But if they're just an unbelieving nation, but not necessarily against God per se, not necessarily trying to destroy Christians or anything like that, then that rate of deterioration lessens significantly. If they are a nation that doesn't necessarily believe in God, but promotes Christianity, allows it to exist, then that rate of deterioration levels out a little bit more. If they are a nation that openly accepts the idea of God, maybe they're not true Christians, but they openly accept the idea of God and promote it in and around all that they do, then that level of deterioration extends out even farther. But it does not get to be perpetual until they finally accept God 100%. And we'll get a little bit more into that. But I just want to look at Babylon for just a second here. And we know that the king Nabopolassar, he formed his empire through the conquests by 616 before the Common Era, and Nebuchadnezzar II drew on those resources to strengthen and enlarge his armed forces as well as engage in building products. He absorbed all of the former regions of the Assyrian Empire and crushed whatever resistance was offered. In 598, 597, before the Common Era, he marched on the kingdom of Judah in Canaan and destroyed its capital city of Jerusalem, sending the elite citizens of the city back to Babylon, a period known as the Babylonian captivity. Further resistance by Judah resulted in another round of military campaigns between 589 and 582 before the Common Era, which reduced the kingdom and scattered the populace. When the Canaanite city of Tyre finally fell to a lengthy siege in 585 before the Common Era, Nebuchadnezzar II had consolidated his empire. By 600 before the Common Era, Babylon was so impressive it was considered the center of the world, certainly by Babylonians themselves and seemingly by others. A clay tablet dating to this time, discovered in the ruins of the city of Sippar north of Babylon and presently in the British Museum, presents an ancient world revolving around Babylon. The tablet purports to be a map of the world, but actually marginalized most of the regions surrounding Babylon, including Sippar. The map's origin is Babylonian, and how it arrived at Sippar is unknown, but it's possible that this piece is one of many held by cities who honored Nebuchadnezzar II's reign and his great urban center. And so you think about this nation, Babylon, and we could go through any one of those nations on that list and many others. But just for a moment, thinking about Babylon, it grew, it became the dominant thing in all of the known world during its period of time, subjugated all of its neighbors, and basically began collecting taxes, revenue from all around. And really, in some ways, even though it conquered all of its neighbors, it also made a very prosperous era while it was large and big. But as we remember, the deterioration rate of a nation and its ability to continue perpetually has a lot to do with where it stands with God. We know, as we just read in the story here, Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar came in and destroyed Judah. We know that that was in part of God's plan, but at the same rate, it still put Babylon against God. And so, how does such a great nation like Babylon fall? It aligns itself against the Creator. And that is true of all nations that will ever exist. And that's important in our story because what we're going to see in the story of Joseph and its prophecy for us today is the potential. And that potential still exists, and every time we step farther away from God, the potential increases for the date of our destruction. So the 7 fat cattle, the 7 lean cattle, the 7 good heads of grain, and the 7 bad ears of grain. A world that hangs in the balance. And that, you know, it seems like a balance there. You've got these 7 fat cattle, the 7 lean cattle. You've got this balance of equal proportion. One of the important things about the number 7, considering all things Hebrew, is that 7 is really considered a perfect number, or the number of God, indicating that what we're going to get into here, God's involved in it. I mean, when you think about the Pharaoh having a dream, why didn't he see 6 fat cattle? Why not 10? Why not 15? I mean, why did God give him 7? And I think that that's very important because God was saying, this is my work. And that's important. So let's get into our story. Genesis 41, 1 through 6. And it came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh dreamed, and behold, he stood by the river. And behold, there came up out of the river 7 well-favored kine, and fat-fleshed, and they fed in a meadow. And behold, 7 other kine came up after them out of the river, ill-favored and lean-fleshed, and stood by the other kine on the brink of the river. And the ill-favored and lean-fleshed kine did eat up the 7 well-favored and fat kine. So Pharaoh awoke. And he slept and dreamed a second dream, and behold, 7 ears of corn came up upon one stalk, rank and good. And behold, 7 thin ears, and blasted with the east wind, sprung up after them. And so, like I said, this is really about the east wind in a way, because remember, 7 indicates perfection or God. It's God's work. And oftentimes in prophecy, when they talked about the east wind, it wasn't just that they were worried about a hurricane or this wind that was odd and out of place. this was typically the act of God. And so in the land of Israel, and we can see a small overhead satellite map here to the right, and Israel is just about in the center, upper center. You can see kind of a triangular type indication there with water below it, water above it, and you can see this cloud of dust. And right in there and above the water or below, in between the water areas there is Israel. To the right, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Iraq, etc. On the left, you have, of course, Egypt and the other African nations that are up there on the northeastern part of it. So in the land of Israel, winds normally blow from the Mediterranean Sea inland in an eastward direction. So normally they're going to come off the ocean and come into Israel. This is important. This has a positive effect in bringing cool, moist air and rain during the winter months to the entire country. However, the opposite can also happen. When the winds blow from the Arabian desert region westwards, the result is very unpleasant. Hot, dry winds distribute a caustic blanket of dust across the entire country. The minute grains of desert dust kill crops and get into every crevice, making breathing very difficult. And so here we have, I mean, the reality of it is this east wind was dangerous. It typically was followed by problems, whether they were health problems, whether they were food production problems. The east wind was not something that anyone considered favorable. And of course, this is oftentimes attributed to God and God acting against his people or against somebody. And so when a prophet talked about the east winds coming in and blowing, that was a negative sign. As we can see, it usually brought in hot, dry winds. That was caustic, that caused difficulty in breathing, all of these difficulties that made life hard to bear. And so we have a couple prophecies here, one in Hosea 13:15 that talks about the east wind. Though he be fruitful among his brethren, an east wind shall come, the wind of the Lord, and that's how we tie these together, shall come up from the wilderness, and his spring shall be dry, and his fountain shall be dried up, and he shall spoil the treasure of all the pleasant vessels. And so here God's bringing in this east wind prophetically, the land's drying up, their wells are drying up, all of their treasure is gone. Because obviously if you don't have water, if you don't have production, now you're relying on your savings, and so everything's gone. And that's what it's talking about, this danger that comes with the east wind. And then in Job 27:21, the east wind carrieth him away, and he departeth, and as a storm hurleth him out of his place. And so now we see actually another aspect of this. This east wind is being attributed to a removal of a people from their place. For example, when Babylon came in and destroyed Jerusalem, essentially an east wind came in, removed Israel out of Jerusalem, Judah, Benjamin out of Jerusalem, took them captive. The Assyrians removed the 10 northern tribes and dispersed them all over the world. And so these are the interpretations of this east wind, which is important because when he saw the seven heads of grain that were not favorable, it says they were blasted with an east wind. And so in comes the curse of God. So we have the 7 fat cows and the 7 lean ones, and the 7 fat ears of corn or heads of grain, and then the 7 lean ears of grain. And so we have this perfect balance, this perfect match. In one side, the perfect blessing, and on the other side, the perfect destruction. And they're coming together. One is going to cancel out the other. That's important because you don't have perpetuality. You have an ending. Okay, let's continue with our story, verse 7 through 11. And the 7 thin ears devoured the 7 rank and full ears. And Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. And it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled. And he sent and called for all of the magicians of Egypt, and all the wise men thereof. And Pharaoh told them his dream, but there was none that could interpret them unto Pharaoh. Then spake the chief butler to Pharaoh, saying, I do remember my faults this day. Pharaoh was wroth with his servant, and put me in ward in the captain of the guard's house, both me and the chief baker. And we dreamed a dream, and one night, I and he, we dreamed, each man according to the interpretation of his dream. And so you have Pharaoh having this dream. He calls in all of his chief advisors. No one can interpret it. Very important. When it says his spirit was troubled, I suspect Pharaoh probably had several dreams. It's not uncommon for people to dream all the time. But he knew somehow in his heart that this particular dream was distinct and different from all the rest. And so his own heart troubled when he woke up. Called in his chief advisors, but none of them could help him. While man is very intelligent and very capable of solving most of his own problems, there is a problem that cannot be solved without input from God. This is one of the greatest irritations of mankind, because natural man wants to be independent from God. We want to be able to solve everything ourselves. We don't want to have to be dependent on God. That is the example in all of these counselors the Pharaoh's calling in. Each one of them is coming with the potential of answers that are physical, whether they're magicians, whether they're whatever they are. These are not men of God. These are not men that have went and prayed and fasted. These are men that are bringing physical answers for a physical problem, and they're mute. They don't have an answer. They don't know what all this means or where it's going. And so there's trouble. But we also have, as it talked about there, and it's important to bring this out, the idea that the 7 lean cows or the 7 lean ears of corn completely devoured the good. There was no good left over. Totally canceled it out. So all the blessing that came was now removed completely by the cursing that came afterwards. That's important, because oftentimes when we're blessed, it changes our life, it changes everything about us. To have that all taken away is very severe, and that's what this is being talked about. And so we have this piece that ties in out of the New Testament, actually speaking towards the believers in Galatians 5:15. But if you bite and devour one another, take heed that you be not consumed one of another. And that's the whole idea. The 7 fat cows were devoured completely by the 7 lean ones. Nothing was left over. And so when you go back to the east wind, it's a biting, it's a heat, it's a destruction. And this is talking about even our own character in and amongst our family, in and amongst our church. When we have this biting and this heat, this anger, this dislike, this hate, this is what consumes us. This is what destroys us from the inside out. And so this is part of the warning of this story of the 7 cattle, or really the 14 cattle. And so let's continue on with the story as it is in Genesis, verse 12 through 16. And there was there with us a young man, a Hebrew, servant to the captain of the guard. And we told him, and he interpreted to us our dream. To each man according to his dream he did interpret. And it came to pass, as he interpreted to us, so it was. Me he restored unto mine office, and him he hanged. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him hastily out of the dungeon. He shaved himself, and changed his raiment, and came unto the Pharaoh. And the Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I have dreamed a dream, and there is none that can interpret it, and I have heard say of thee that thou canst understand a dream to interpret it. And Joseph answered the Pharaoh, saying, It is not in me. God shall give the Pharaoh an answer of peace. Very important, this passage. And so the cupbearer to the king, he remembers in the dungeon was this young man, Joseph. Very important, because Joseph is the God input. He's the peace of God through the Holy Spirit that brings in an answer to an epic problem that has no human answer. That's important. And so the Pharaoh, who is an ungodly man, really, he's got a vast horde of his own gods that he worships. He's not a believer in the one true God, but he calls in Joseph, and he wants Joseph to answer his dream. Accordingly, just like all of his own advisors, he expected Joseph to come in and give an answer of himself. Joseph answers that immediately, so as to dispel all doubts and establish the way things are going. Joseph says, it's not in me. I can't answer. This is not me that's going to give you a solution. God has to do it. It's the God piece of the input. That's the only way that we can have this perpetuality that keeps going. Without acknowledging God, we have destruction. Let's continue on with verse 17 through 22. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, In my dream, behold, I stood upon the banks of a river, and behold, there came up out of the river 7 kine, or cattle, fat-fleshed and well-favored, and they fed in a meadow. And behold, 7 other kine came up after them, poor and ill-favored, and lean-fleshed, such as I never saw in all the land of Egypt for badness. And the lean and the ill-favored kine did eat up the first 7 fat kine. And when they had eaten them up, it could not be known that they had eaten them, but they were still ill-favored, as at the beginning. So I awoke, and I saw in my dream, and behold, 7 ears came up in one stalk, full and good. And so this is important in 20 and 21. The 7 ill-favored cattle totally devour the fat ones. And it's not like they're eating the fat ones and they're getting fat. They're still ill-favored and ugly. They devour completely the fat ones, and they're still present, ill-flavored and ugly. And this is important because you can't change until you bring in God, until you fully acknowledge Him. So let's go on with 23 to 28. And behold, 7 ears, withered, thin, and blasted, and there's this terminology that we were talking about, with the east wind, sprung up after them. In other words, this is God coming in, and He is causing this destruction. Verse 24, And the thin ears devoured the 7 good ears. And I told this unto the magicians, and there was none that could declare it to me. And Joseph said unto the Pharaoh, The dream of the Pharaoh is one. God hath shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. So Joseph, after he hears this dream, acknowledges this is truly a dream from God. It's not just a dream that you happen to have in the evening. And so let's continue in 26. The 7 good kine are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dream is one. And the 7 thin and ill-favored kine that came up after them are 7 years. And the 7 empty ears, blasted with the east wind, shall be 7 years of famine. This is the thing which I have spoken unto the Pharaoh. What God is about to do, He showeth unto Pharaoh. So God steps in and He shows Pharaoh the future. Not because Pharaoh's a believer, but God's actually bringing in Joseph to save God's people, Israel. Because Joseph's brothers, his family, they are out there and they're going to be lost in this. God needs a player in here that can help His people. So He gives the Pharaoh a dream that only one can interpret. The Pharaoh brings out Joseph, and Joseph gives him the interpretation. This is important because you cannot have continuance without God. Verse 29 through 34, Behold, there come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt, and there shall arise after them 7 years of famine, and all the plenty shall be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine shall consume the land. And the plenty shall not be known in the land by reason of that famine following, for it shall be grievous. And for that the dream was doubled unto the Pharaoh twice. It is because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. Now therefore let Pharaoh look out, a man discreet and wise, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers of the land, and take up a 5th part of the land of Egypt in the 7 plenteous years. And so he's explaining through the Holy Spirit's understanding what this dream means for the Pharaoh. And this is bringing this trial, this tribulation, this epic problem into Egypt. There's going to be these years of plenty first off that are going to be wonderful, but there's going to be these 7 years of famine. And the famine is going to be so horrible, it's going to just consume the land. It's going to destroy it. And people won't even remember the good years. The famine will be so terrible. And God gave this dream to the Pharaoh twice so that the Pharaoh would understand that this is truly from God. And just like God promises in the scripture, He says that when something comes from Him, He will give it to us 2 or 3 times, or 2 or 3 witnesses, so that we know the truth of it. And so Joseph gives them a recommendation. In all of your kingdom, look for someone's discreet and wise. Set him or them over the land of Egypt and start working towards preparing for the 7 bad years by setting apart in the good years a little bit of produce. And so here Joseph's just giving some counsel. I'm sure around the Pharaoh, as we recall back in when we were looking at the different artifacts that have come out of Egypt during this period of time, they were actually a very technically advanced place. I'm sure the Pharaoh had some very good counselors, very capable of handling this seemingly very simple task. The simple task of just collecting up a fifth of everyone's harvest, sacking it away in bins, and saving it for the 7 bad years. Why doesn't the Pharaoh select one of his own counselors? That's an interesting question to think about. Verse 35 through 40, and let them gather all the food of those good years that come, and lay up corn under the hand of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities. And that food shall be for the store to the land against the 7 years of famine, which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land perish not through the famine. And this thing was good in the eyes of Pharaoh, and in the eyes of all of his servants. And the Pharaoh said unto his servants, Can we find such a one as this is a man in whom is the Spirit of God? And so there's this immediate recollection, this immediate understanding in Pharaoh's own mind. Joseph's not your average Joe. He is a very special person, and there is a spirit in him that is very desirable in this problem. Again, the solution that Joseph gave is a very simple one. It's just a matter of setting aside food and granaries all throughout the land for the bad years. Anyone could have done it. But the Pharaoh recognizes the reality. Not anyone can do it. This is an east wind. This is a divine power that's coming in and causing this. Therefore, in order for us to have a solution, we need a person in whom is a divine spirit. Obviously, none of his own counselors had it. They couldn't interpret the dream. But in Joseph was a divine spirit. And so he needed Joseph. He understood that it was Joseph that could give them the exit. Another important thing just to look at just for a moment here, if we remember, Joseph was pretty young when he was sold into Egypt. He's not that much older now. He's been raised, he's grown a little bit in Potiphar's house and then in prison. He's not been going to school, college, or anything like that. So where does his wisdom come by? We have to understand that part of his wisdom came from his education as a child. But a lot of this wisdom is coming from God. So, verse 39, and Pharaoh said unto Joseph, Forasmuch as God hath showed thee all this, there is none so discreet and wise as thou art. Thou shalt be over my house, and according unto thy word shall all my people be ruled. Only in the throne will I be greater than thou. And so essentially, the Pharaoh, in this one brief moment, raises Joseph right up and makes him second in the kingdom. He's not just second in the kingdom, he's actually over the Pharaoh's own house. And so aside from everyone else in the whole country, there's only one greater than Joseph. That's the Pharaoh himself. And so in a sense, Joseph is almost equal in all ways to the Pharaoh. He would have had the same power. He would have had the same ability. Everyone would have treated him basically the same. The only one greater than Joseph was the Pharaoh himself. So the distinction is very minimal between the two of them and the positions that they have. And this is important because Joseph is the input that can save. And that's important to remember. In our story, Egypt has an insurmountable problem. The blessings they are about to receive, they are also about to lose. 7 good years replaced by 7 horrific years. What can be done? This is where Egypt recognizes that the only answer is the godly man Joseph. The Pharaoh likely had many very wise counselors. Why didn't he choose one of them? As I mentioned earlier, because none of them could save Egypt. It would take a divine answer, just as the dreams required divine answers. This did not mean that the Pharaoh was accepting the God of Joseph as his God. Absolutely not. In fact, we have the next piece of the story where the Pharaoh gives Joseph his own priest's daughter in marriage. emphasizing this separation and appeasing his own priests and gods. But this is only something that works for a very limited time. In other words, the efforts of the Pharaoh to continue to hold on to his own religious distinctions while at the same time giving some recognition to God, it only works for a while. You're still deteriorating as a country. You're still going to come to an end and a destruction. And we know that's true of Egypt. In the time of Moses, when Israel left, they were basically left totally destroyed and annihilated. And historically, we know that there was another group of people that came in just a little after that and actually took possession of Egypt and began to have dominion and reign in Egypt. And so we know for a fact, historically, that this is true, that because at this moment, if the Pharaoh had recognized 100% the true God, the only God, it would have changed the history of the world. But Israel would have never left Egypt. And Israel still had to go to the promised land after all these events. So Pharaoh, he gives a token recognition to God, but it's not a true recognition. And that's important to always remember. Let's continue on our story, 41 through 45. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I have set thee over all the land of Egypt." And Pharaoh took off his ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand and arrayed him in vestures of fine linen and put a gold chain about his neck. And he made him to ride in the second chariot which he had. And they cried before him, "Bow the knee." And he made him ruler over all the land of Egypt. And the Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, and without thee shall no man lift up his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt." And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zephnath-paneah. Very important, this new name. And he gave him to wife Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. And Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. And so here we have him being raised up. He's giving him a new name, and he's giving him his own priest, the Pharaoh's own priest's daughter, as a wife. So let's continue in verse 46 through 51. And Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before the king of Egypt. And so we've got this period of time from when he was sold by his brothers till now. Somewheres, who knows, more than 10 years probably, when he was in Potiphar's house for a period in there and also in prison for a period in there. So now he's 30 years old. He's still very young for a position of this type, to be second in command in a country. He hasn't had the training to be, for instance, a vice president comparatively, or a second to a king. He hasn't had any of the training of Egypt for what it takes to hold this position and operate appropriately. But here he is, just out of the blue. God sticks him in here just as he is. Verse 47, and in the 7 plenteous years the earth brought forth a handful. And he gathered up all the food of the 7 years, which were in the land of Egypt, and laid up the food in the cities. The food of the field, which was round about every city, laid he up at the same time. And Joseph gathered corn as the sand of the sea, very much, until he left numbering, for it was without number. And unto Joseph were born 2 sons, before the years of the famine came, which Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, bare unto him. And Joseph called the name of the first Manasseh. For God, said he, hath made me forget all my toil and all of my father's house. And so you have this preceding of events. Joseph, he's married, has 2 children, Manasseh, and the next one we're going to see in the next verse is Ephraim. He begins saving up grain, and it's a tremendous quantity of grain that they're saving up, and they're saving it for 7 years, which in and of itself is a tremendous ability. Typically, it's very difficult to save seeds for this kind of time. You have to have very special storage facilities, and so that also tells us a lot about Egypt. I mean, if you just go down and you buy seeds at your local seed shop and you put them in a jar on your shelf, in 7 years, most likely they're going to be useless. And so they had a practice here that was very special, again, showing us that they were actually a very advanced culture. Let's continue in verse 52 to 57. And the name of the second called he Ephraim, for God hath caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. And the 7 years of plenteousness that was in the land of Egypt were ended, and the 7 years of dearth began to come, according to Joseph has said. And the dearth was in all lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. And when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. And Pharaoh said unto all the Egyptians, Go to Joseph. What he saith to you, do it. And the famine was over all the face of the earth, and Joseph opened up the storehouses and sold unto the Egyptians. And the famine waxed sore in all the land of Egypt. And all countries came into Egypt to Joseph for to buy corn, because that the famine was so sore in the land. And so you have this proceeding of events. Joseph, as it says, has his 2 children, Ephraim and Manasseh. Important. They are born just before the 7 years of famine are arriving. And so they're actually being born and beginning to grow in the years of plenty. And that's important because this is also prophetical. And as they're growing, then the lands, the years of famine hit, and Joseph begins to sell back to the people everything that the Pharaoh collected from the people. And even all the countries round about begin to come and buy corn. So, as this story continues to unfold, we have this moment when Egypt hangs in the balance. And without at least a symbolic recognition of the one true God, they will be completely destroyed. If Joseph wasn't there, Egypt would have been lost. They would have done the best they could, but they would have never survived the 7 years of famine. They needed the God input, or this input from a man of God. And so Egypt gives this symbolic recognition to the one true God. And so Egypt does its part, gives its token recognition to God. The heart of this problem is, by only giving token recognition to God, they are only delaying the inevitable destruction that rebellion brings. And we know this to be true, as I already mentioned, when Moses takes the house of Israel out of Egypt. So, to avoid the destruction and achieve the perpetual motion as a nation requires not just token recognition of God, but the placement of God as our absolute ruler, king, and maximum authority. We must turn our futures and lives over to Him and trust that only He knows best how to solve all things. We must submit, not tokenly, but willingly with all of our hearts. And this goes against the wants and the desires of the natural man. We, in our carnal flesh, will not do this ever. And Mosiah gives us these words that God spoke in Mosiah 1:119. For the natural man is an enemy to God, and has been from the fall of Adam, and will be forever and ever. And this is the conflict that's in here. So a natural man can recognize that there is a power out there that they need to at least give token respect to. And that's what the Pharaoh's doing here. He's not changing his God. He's not changing his religion. He's merely giving token recognition for God's help. And God does help him through Joseph. Like I said, it's not a permanent help. And that's important. So this brings us to today, our period of history. If the story of Joseph is prophetic for the second coming of Christ, then we must understand that we, whoever we are in this big world, need to turn to God and not tokenly. The events that we are seeing in this study should stand out as warning signs. So as we look at as our period of time, our history, both before today and after today, there are some things that we should be seeing. Number one, there should be prophetical warnings being given. Dreams, visions, not just through Christ's church, the Church of Christ, but there should be dreams and visions being given more openly around us. And I think that's pretty important that we recognize. Thinking about the United States, oftentimes there are people who refer to Washington's vision. I know there was a second vision very similar to Washington's. I don't remember who it was who had it. I believe it was a general in the U.S. military. But those are the kind of things. I know people can't prove that the Washington's vision came from Washington or whatever, but those kind of prophetic warnings should be being heard. Now, we may question them, we may doubt them, but they're out there, and that's important. Number two, a time of great blessing and a knowledge of God. Joseph comes in, he gives us understanding. There's going to be 7 fat cattle. There's going to be this time of blessing, this time of prosperity, and this time of knowledge of God. Joseph is present, and Joseph is giving knowledge of God. The Pharaoh had to give this token reverence to God. And then number 3, you have the turn and a time of great calamity, from the 7 fat cattle to the 7 lean cattle. This calamity that comes in, this difficulty, this breaking of the financial backing, this breaking of the political backing, just this whole disruption of society and the world as we know it. And then you have number 4, the need of the Messiah ben Joseph, and that's the token thing that Joseph himself is in this story. The Pharaoh says at the end of the 7 years of blessing and the beginning of the 7 years of famine, when the people are running out of food and getting hungry, what does he say? Go to Joseph. Joseph has the answer. And so Joseph in this story is becoming the Messiah for Egypt. But in our own period of time, we're looking to Christ's second coming. This Joseph that is going to again come and save a part of the world and, most importantly, save his own people. When Joseph begins to dish out food to the Egyptians are not believers in any way, but he begins to dish out food to the Egyptians, then Joseph's brothers come in, and we'll see this as we go on in this story, not in this study, but in the future. Joseph then saves his own family also, and that's important. That's this Messiah position that Joseph is taking and that Jesus will now take in our time. And then prophetically, right after, or during, I should say, probably towards the end, roughly speaking, of the 7 years of blessing, arises Ephraim and Manasseh. And this is important because they play out in prophecy. As we've seen in the previous studies, when I spoke a little bit more about the birthright, and how the birthright was passed in part from Reuben to Judah, Levi, and Joseph. And through Joseph, the birthright was passed to Ephraim and Manasseh. And we read a passage that talked about Ephraim and Manasseh bringing the world together, pushing the world together by their horns. And that's important because that's going to play into another part of prophecy. So you have the rise of Ephraim and Manasseh right after the time of right before the end of the time of blessing, right before the beginning of the time of famine. They begin to grow. At this point, they're kids. Even if they were born in the first year, at maximum, they're 7 years old, one of them, because one's older than the other. So they're still very young, but they're coming to the point of the famine, and they're present. That's important prophetically. So the input that saves, the God part, that is Joseph, but now we look at our own time, and that has to be Jesus Christ himself. And so let's go to another prophecy that ties into this, and the whole idea that without God, there is no perpetual motion as far as a nation is concerned. 2 Nephi chapter 1, verse 16 through 25. And behold, it is wisdom that this land should be kept as yet from the knowledge of other nations. And specifically, Lehi is receiving a prophecy for the Americas, where he and his family is sitting. But this prophecy still holds true for all people that hold the nations of the Americas, and also for some other lands. Verse 17, for behold, many nations would overrun this land, that there would be no place for an inheritance. Wherefore I, Lehi, have obtained a promise, that inasmuch as they which the Lord God shall bring out of the land of Jerusalem shall keep his commandment, they shall prosper on the face of this land. That's what creates perpetuality. When we keep God's commandments, when we put him first in our life, God blesses us. The blessing isn't because we've got the best seed or the most intelligent people, the best schools, etc. The blessing comes from God. He puts in to this nation machine and creates something that continues indefinitely and even gets better. like we talked about in the beginning when we talked about the definition of perpetual. Verse 19, and they shall be kept from all other nations, that they may possess this land unto themselves. And so this land was originally given to Lehi's descendants as they came over from Jerusalem. But we also know from the Book of Mormon itself, there was a people here prior to them from the Book of Ether. They received the land for their inheritance, but they were eventually destroyed off, fulfilling this prophecy even before Lehi received it as a promise. So Lehi receives a promise that was already fulfilled once before Lehi was even born, because the people that Ether talks about in the Book of Ether, they were a great nation on this land, very blessed. They also were removed and destroyed, and that's what this is talking about. Verse 20 through 22, and if it so be that they shall keep his commandments, they shall be blessed upon the face of the land. And there shall be none to molest them, nor to take away the land of their inheritance. And they shall dwell safely, important this word, forever, perpetually. There's no end to it, because they're obeying God's commandments and God's blessing them. So they're continually growing, getting better, wiser, more astute, better technology, etc., etc. But only as long as God's in the mix. Verse 22, but behold, when the time cometh that they shall dwindle in unbelief, after they have received so great blessings from the hand of the Lord, having a knowledge of the creation of the earth and all men, knowing the great and marvelous works of the Lord from the creation of the world, having power given to them to do all things by faith, having all the commandments from the beginning, and having been brought to his infinite goodness into the precious land of promise. Verse 23 to verse 25. Behold, I say, if the day shall come that they will reject the Holy One of Israel, the true Messiah, their Redeemer and their God, behold, the judgments of him that is just shall rest upon them. Yea, he will bring other nations unto them, and he will give unto them power, and he shall take away from them the lands of their possession, and he will cause them to be scattered and to be smitten. Yea, as one generation passeth to another, there shall be bloodshed and great visitations among them. So when the day comes that they begin to reject God, and that's a deterioration. It's not that they just remove him completely from one day to the next. It's that they slowly begin to change. They don't want prayer publicly. They don't want public signs of God. They're just slowly weeding out one by one even the token references to God, and destroying all things that focus on God. And so what does God say? His judgment begins to come upon them. This is what Egypt's looking at very simply between the 7 fat cattle and the 7 lean cattle. Here is Joseph, this man of God, interprets the dream, brings God into the knowledge of the Pharaohs, and they only want to give that token recognition. They don't want to give the complete recognition to God. And so they're going to deteriorate. They're going to be destroyed. And that's what this promise is. If we don't turn over our lives 100%, we will be removed. Like it says about the east wind, they will be removed from their place. They will be destroyed, burnt, devoured. He will take away the lands of their possession and give it to someone else. They will be scattered. The idea, when you take dry leaves and you put a strong wind into it, that just scatters it. And that's the promise that Lehi was given. So now let's look at a revelation that was given through Granville Hedrick back in 1864 in the Church of Christ. Because again, this ties in prophetically to today. It says, "Hear, O ye people who call yourself the Church of Christ. Hearken to the counsel of your Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, and give ear to the words given you by the power of his Holy Spirit, because of the great destructions that are coming upon the land. For thus it shall be upon our country. It shall be attacked by a mighty foe on the south and east, by a combination of strong nations, and the eastern cities of the coast shall fall in the storm of battle, and the great Atlantic Ocean will be blockaded by a combined fleet up the coast, and all the federal government upon the high seas will be endangered." So he begins bringing into this prophecy this terrible destruction that is going to be on the United States, the Americas. and this turmoil that is coming in by these foes. And this is important. It says, "Woe, woe to the proud cities of the east, for their railroads shall be torn up, and poverty and misery pervade the land. The greatest consternation will spread through the northern states because of war and bloodshed, and great political divisions will arise through the government between the states, and many of them will set up for themselves separate governments, and great tumults will arise among the people in the uproarious clamor of dissension, and the financial crash will cover the land as the turbulent waves of the sea. The proud, the rich, as well as the poor, will feel the pangs of hunger and the shame of nakedness, and old garments will be rent to mend others. And thus shall the proud be humbled in the dust, and sit down upon the ground, hungry and naked, or in other words, in scarcity of food and raiment." Remember when I went through the 5 different signs? This was given back in 1864. This is a sign. This is an announcement of a potential. Nothing more. The potential becomes reality because we drift away from God. That's the promise. So, "Yet men in unbelief of God's forewarning will harden their hearts against the true light of the gospel, and tyranny and oppression will rule among the wicked, and liberty be trampled underfoot because of military rule. And that great and abominable church, the mother of abominations, will call upon the men of her creed to establish her dominion over the once renowned land of freedom. And terrible and mighty will be the conflict. But glory be to God, for the people of the West will stand up in great strength for liberty, and God will help them. And he will stir up the kings of the eastern world in their anger, and they will be divided against each other, and gather their armies together to battle. And that great and abominable church will be arrayed against herself, for God will pour out sore afflictions and mighty judgments upon her." And so you have this terrible calamity coming into the United States, into the Americas, under this 7 lean cattle. So we've had all these years of blessings and prosperity. We have so many great things today. In the Americas, the reality is, even in third world countries, we have great levels of blessings. And so that's what the promise was, the 7 fat cattle. Now coming to the 7 lean cattle, this tragic change of events that comes through many different things. And so you see this wars and rumors of wars, and not all of this necessarily has to be physical wars. There are greater types of wars, psychological warfare, also chemical warfare, things of that nature that can happen from these other countries. But God is pouring out his sore affliction, his mighty judgment. This is the east wind coming in. And of course we have the prophecy also in Revelations in the New Testament that talks about the whore, the woman dressed in purple who is sitting on this dragon, and when she falls, or when Babylon falls, which is what this is again speaking of. Babylon the Great has fallen, and all the nations of the world are weeping. And all of this ties together in that. But a free and independent government will be established in the West by true lovers of liberty and servants of the Most High God. God has got to be in this for it to succeed, upon the broad basis of equal rights and privileges in all truth and righteousness. And it shall increase in the favor of all good and just men. And it shall grow and prosper by the power of the Almighty God. And peace and safety shall be established throughout all of her dominions, which shall become truly great. Thus saith the Spirit of the living God. And of course we have the prophecy in Isaiah, I believe it's chapter 2, where it talks about the mountain of God's kingdom being set up over all other nations. And it says that other nations will say, "Let us go up to the mountain of the God to learn of his ways." And that's what we're having in this prophecy, that piece of the next section of our prophecy. So now let's go into 3 Nephi chapter 9, where we see that there's another prophecy that goes perfectly well with what Granville Hedrick saw when he was speaking of what was happening here in the Americas. And this is 3 Nephi chapter 9, verses 101 through 106. This whole chapter really is very exceptional, but just these last verses that tie into what Granville saw. Verse 101, it says, "Yea, woe be to the Gentiles." And so those that are living on the Americas in the United States, God is still considering them at this late date Gentiles, even those who are believers. Doesn't matter, because the word Gentile still means those who are not part of the house of Israel, the 12 tribes. And so when the church was restored, it was restored among the Gentiles. That's what this is talking about. And so, woe be unto the Gentiles, except they repent. For it shall come to pass in that day, saith the Father, that I will cut off their horses out of the midst of thee. I will destroy their chariots. I will cut off the cities of thy land, and throw down all strongholds. I will cut off witchcrafts out of thy hand, and thou shalt have no more soothsayers. Thy graven images I will also cut off, and thy standing images out of the midst of thee. And thou shalt no more worship the works of thy hands. And so this is actually really epic. And if you are looking at current events in the news, you will see that some of this is already beginning to take place. And it doesn't matter to God, it doesn't matter whether you're conservative or liberal per se in a political way. God has no interest in that. God is following his own path, which goes for truth, justice, and equity, and him being the king. And when he said no standing images, he meant no standing images. And if we look at not just the United States, but actually the world over, all over the place, the standing images, the graven images are being torn down. And a lot of conservatives are standing up, and they're mad because some of these images are in memory of great people. God doesn't care. He's bringing them down. And when we array ourselves against God, even when it doesn't matter if it was Christopher Columbus, it doesn't matter if it was Washington himself, when God says he's bringing them down, you do not want to array yourself against him. You do not want to oppose that. You can just step back and let God do his work. There's a reason for what he's doing. And he talks about destroying the chariots, the horses. That's our means of transportation. Also cutting off thy cities. And if you've been watching the news, you'll see that there's all kinds of turmoil. And already in the news, a lot of cities are talking about disbanding their police department, basically having no rule of law or way of enforcing a rule of law. And this is just opening up chaos in all ways. This is what the prophecy is. This chaos is going to grow even more. Witchcraft's going to be taken out, soothsayers, all of this fake stuff, just like the Pharaoh, when he had his dreams and he brought them to his counselors had no answers. They couldn't answer this problem. This problem was far larger than them. And if you've been watching at all the pandemic of COVID, as it transpired, all of the great counselors came out and gave their opinions using computers, etc., etc. And this isn't to diss them in their capacity, but when God is in this, there's no way we can guess, not even close, what's going to happen. So man has no say in this or even way to answer this problem. We've got to go, just like Pharaoh did. He called in Joseph, the man of God. We've got to call in Jesus Christ. He's the only answer, the Messiah ben Joseph, for this problem. Let's continue with 104 to 106. And I will pluck up thy groves out of the midst of thee, so will I destroy thy cities. And it shall come to pass that all lying and deceiving, envies and strife, and priestcrafts and whoredoms shall be done away with. All these things are going to be terminated. Sins, and especially the kind of sins that deteriorate nations, deteriorate people. God's taken them out. For it shall come to pass, saith the Father, that at that day whosoever will not repent and come unto my beloved Son, that's Jesus Christ, the Messiah ben Joseph, who's coming to save his people and the Egyptians, them will I cut off from among my people, O house of Israel. And I will execute vengeance and fury upon them, even as upon the heathen, such as they have not heard. Why is God coming in? I mean, a lot of people, if they were to look at the United States as an example, would say it's a godly country. God doesn't see it that way. That's why these prophecies are here. And 61 million aborted babies are going to be there testifying that the United States is not a godly nation. We have not stopped those murders, and we cannot stop them. There's not enough people to stop them. Even now, with a very conservative president in office who seems very gung-ho to solve all kinds of problems, abortion has not been able to be stopped. Homosexuality has not been able to be stopped. Homosexual marriage is not being stopped. These are the things that God hates. These are abominations that destroy a people. And so this is all coming to pass because regardless of the fact that our money says in God we trust, the fact is it's just token. And God is tired of that token recognition. Now we are going to receive the payment of our dues. This is the story of the 7 fat cattle and the 7 lean cattle and the destruction of all of that blessing until the people came to recognize God. Thank you for your time. Hope this study helps you and inspires you. I know there's even more in this story that we're going to be touching on. The next series, the next part of this study, I'm already getting excited to get into. I haven't a clue where I'm going to go with it, but it has to do with Ephraim and Manasseh. Have a good day. God bless.